A deal on Dickens, who could resist? A stack of Austen, warmly kissed. Golden Age crime tales twist and turn, every page a treasure to learn. Books keep coming home with me, piles so tall they're all I see. Turn a page and sail the sea, reading always feels so free.
Hi, my name is Talia. Welcome to Talia Nerds Out. I have been absent from booktube for about a week. I know that it's probably not terribly noticeable because I'm not the best at keeping up. I do need to get better at that. I know I owe a lot of people comments, and I'm trying to get through watching some people's videos as well. But this past week I was on a Zoom based religious retreat, and then I had I was doing my perpetual vows for the Institute of Our Lady of Annunciation. If people are interested in hearing more about that, I can go more into that, but it's an organization within the Catholic Church, not necessarily terribly well known, so I can go into it more if people have more interest. But these were my perpetual vows. It's been about 8 years to get to this point. But yeah, so it was a big deal for me, and I was spending most of the time just sort of, I wanted to keep very focused on the retreat and not really have a whole lot of other distractions that also did affect what I read during this period of time, because again, I wanted to keep things pretty focused on the religious atmosphere I was trying to keep, to feel like I was going on a retreat, since being homebound, I can't actually go to a retreat house. But I also was not wanting to read some of my books based on fiction or anything like that, because I was really trying to keep a good focus. So I was continuing to read Eamon Duffing's Stripping the Altar, and I do feel like I made a decent amount of progress on this, all things considered. And I also started and finished another book for a little bit more of relaxing kind of reading, but still keeping in that kind of religious feel. So I started on July 7th and I finished it July 11th, and I was getting the library card I had created because I couldn't remember how long it actually took me to finish it. So I did a pretty quick turnaround. Now, this book was only 194 pages, but it was still a pretty quick turnaround considering the fact that I was on retreat. So there was 2 talks a day, plus the extra hours of the Divine Office and reading Stripping the Altars. But the book that I started and finished was The Women Who Saved Catholic England, Risking All to Protect Tudor and Stuart Priests. So this counts for quarter 3 of Historathon, which is very convenient. It's by Martin Beardsley. This is put out by Pen and Sword Press. It's Pen and Sword History, specifically. So I have kind of a love-hate relationship when it comes to pen and sword books. I like the topics they choose to address in their books, but I think that as a newer publication, maybe their editing team isn't quite fully together yet, because I have noticed several times things that could have been fixed in several of their publications that could have been fixed with maybe more stringent editing, or maybe even like just their editing department saying, hey, you need to tighten this up a little bit to the author, or even fixing things that are just like basic errors that you would hope an editor would catch. And I will go through one of them as I talk about this book. So initially, some of my issues were, I wasn't sure how I felt about this book initially. I was very excited and interested in the topic. However, I was not thrilled about the author's style. And I do think that it was a very simple fix because this author, their style is not irreparable. Actually, their style, when they avoid these certain mistakes, is very readable. But my problem with this author is just he has a tendency to use a certain phrase a lot to the point where it's like it's sloppy. It's not very professional. It's something that a good editor will catch and cut out. They'll say, no, look, you need to tighten this up. But when they leave it in there, it's like, oh, this kind of feels like a blog post. Can you just tighten this up a little bit? So I'm trying to find one of the times, because he does this a lot. Now, the farther he got in the book, I felt like he did it less. But then he slipped into it again a little bit towards the end. Now, as I'm looking for an example of what I'm talking about, because I didn't necessarily tab like I should have every time I saw it. But he came upon the idea of doing this book because of his research for a book that he did on the gunpowder plot, which is actually, I think, the first book that I saw from him. I think I ended up either trying to pick it up on by ebook or picking up on ebook like on a huge discount back when it first came out. Haven't read it yet. I do intend to read the physical form just because it's easier for me to absorb that information. Okay, so I went and I found 3 specific examples of the issue that I am referring to that I feel like they could have tightened this up and not had this verbiage, and it would have sounded better and more professional. So this particular author tends to and I am well aware that it might have seemed more frequent to me because I know I didn't mark the full number of times this author has used this phrase, but I also know that I found it particularly annoying, so I'm probably more sensitive to and thinking that he might have done it maybe even more than he actually did. So I will give that caveat. But this author likes to use a phrase similar to as we shall soon see. And he uses this a lot, which to me, or like I said, it seems like a lot to me. He used it multiple times. And it's unnecessary. There are ways to do it better. It just doesn't feel very professional. Like, that's a blog post kind of thing. But here's an example. This is page 9. Let's see. The following year, there was a complaint that the Jesuit priest, Father Edmund Campion, who, as we shall see, would go on to tutor the Vaux children, was living with them. And the who, as we shall see, is in parentheses. Now, parentheses can be a bit iffy anyway, because you can argue if it's in parentheses, is it something that's completely necessary to the actual sentence? So one could possibly argue that it can be either way with that, but to have this as we shall see sentence also parenthetical doesn't really help it any, in my opinion. I think that you could have been perfectly well served to just tighten that up and say instead, the following year, there was a complaint that the Jesuit priest, Father Edmund Campion, was living with them. We shall soon be seeing that he will be tutoring the Vaux children. That doesn't need to be said now. Save that information for later. Let us soon see it instead of putting it in here where it doesn't really add anything to the narrative. Then another example is, okay, this one is not an as we shall soon see sentence, but this is very similar in feel. It's another one of those repetitive, unnecessary phrases that if you're saying as we have already or as we shall soon, you have to question, okay, if we've already said this and we shall soon be, or we shall be soon be saying this, you had to question whether or not this needs to be said now. Yes, it's one thing in speech. You might find a lot of repetitiveness, especially if you're dealing with an unedited video. I am not creating a professional documentary style video. This is unprofessional, and it's not intended to be anywhere near professional. But when you are releasing a historical book, I do hold you to a higher standard. And I know that I might be in a minority with this. I have been told that I am too particular, but it does affect my enjoyment of the book, because I can see where a small tweak could have elevated that writing style, made it less clunky. So here's the example that I wanted to give. As well as frequently, and this is from page 18, as well as frequently taking in priests, we have already heard that Margaret set up in her basement or some lower level room a school for the Catholic instruction of the children of neighbors, complete with its own resident teacher, a man called Stapleton. Now, I can see where you might want to repeat that piece of information. Maybe you're afraid that the reader forgot it. But I think that there's a way to better word that, so that way it's not... The "we have already heard" just feels like a very unprofessional, very much of a "I'm having a conversation with you" kind of thing. And that's, I don't know, it doesn't really feel like it has a place in a history book. I think that a better, because let's see where they last mentioned the fact that they had a school. Because they might not even need to do it quite so soon where they have to repeat that. Okay, so I can see where you might want to repeat the bit of information that you have the school, because it's been, looks like a couple pages since they last mentioned that. But I think that if you want to tighten it up a little bit, okay, so I actually found it wasn't a couple pages before. It was up the paragraph before. So the previous paragraph, which first brought in the idea that Margaret had a school in their basement. It's a quote, actually. The Clitheroe home had to have been one of the chief mass centers of York, with priests and lay people coming and going, children being taught in the basement, and having had a secret escape route to the next door property he created. And then you have the next paragraph where you have the sentence that I take issue with, which is, as well as frequently taking in priests, we have already heard that Margaret set up in her basement or some lower level room a school for Catholic instruction of the children of neighbors, complete with a resident teacher, a man called Stapleton. Now, if you want to avoid that clunky, unnecessary, we have already heard sentence, I feel like you could instead just say something to the effect of, as well as frequently taking in priests, Margaret's basement school for the Catholic instruction of the children of neighbors was complete with its own resident teacher, a man called Stapleton, which is a little tighter, less clunky, less informal. I don't know. I just feel like it's a better way of presenting that information, at least a less annoying way of presenting that information. But I am nitpicky when it comes to that sort of thing. It just gets under my skin a little bit. If you can't tell. And then the next example that I have, like I said, there are other ones. And yes, I have done a like I have said. I am not writing an official history book. This person is. So the next example of I think this is another "as we shall soon see" kind of sentence. Let me see. Here it is. This may be true of his typical hyperbole, and this is from page 20. This may be true of his typical hyperbole, but if half of what he tells us about Margaret is true, it could well be an accurate representation of her demeanor. And now this is another parenthetical. Although, as we shall see, the York authorities were probably much more sympathetic towards her than he can bring himself to admit. Now, with the way this is written, the author actually repeats several times that the people involved, the authorities involved, were likely more sympathetic than the then I think, what was the name of that the priest Mush was willing to admit. So I think that leaving this parenthetical out here would actually strengthen the work and the effect later when the author mentions that the people in charge were more sympathetic than Mush was willing to admit. So I think that you could just as well go, this might be a typical hyperbole, but if half of what he tells us about Margaret is true, it could well be an accurate representation of her demeanor. And then you go down further, and then and it says, Margaret almost seems to desire to be a martyr. And there's points later on where they don't even outright say that the horrific cruelty of her eventual, this is next page, the horrific cruelty of her eventual punishment has given rise to the impression that authorities in York were a heartless, bloodthirsty bunch, but, and contrary to his religiously influenced railings against him, Mush's own account of these proceedings show that this was far from the case. In fact, many of those present could see with a growing sense of horror whether his leading and clearly motivated by genuine human compassion did everything in their power to persuade Margaret to enter a plea. So, the "as we shall soon see" sentence from the page before is absolutely unnecessary, because when we're more in the action, we do actually soon see. So I think that the editor would have served the author better if they had said, hey, just snip that out. Your reader will soon see that. Now, here's an example of where the author has foreshadowing that's done well, not an "as we shall soon see" parenthetical. So it's on page 44. The early 1580s were an eventful time for the The early 1580s were an eventful time for the Vaux family and Catholicism in England. In the summer of 1580, when Eleanor and Edward had been married for only a few years, two men arrived from the continent, in disguise and traveling under false names, who were to play a role, albeit a brief one, in the lives of both sisters. So it's a way that isn't clunky, does prepare, it lets you know. I think the difference between this and an "as we shall soon see" phrase is that this one is an action. These men arrived, and they will, who are to play a role in their lives. So it's letting you know that there's going to be a connection, but it's not in the same kind of sloppy way that the "as we shall soon see" is. Because if you leave out the who are to play a role, albeit a brief one, in the lives of both sisters, connects these two men, are telling you why you care about these two men that are arriving now. Whereas the "as we shall soon see," a lot of times when it's made use of, the Father Edmund Campion, who, as we shall soon see, would go on to tutor the Vaux children, that as we shall soon see sentence or phrase isn't something that you need to know then, or you already know that he's connected to the Vaux family. So the fact that he will go on to tutor the Vaux children isn't necessary to know now, because you already know that he's at that time connected to them. Whereas when you have the much later use of the example of the two men arrived from the continent in disguise and traveling under false names, who were to play a role, albeit a brief one, in the lives of both sisters, it's saying, hey, these men are arriving and let's connect them. They're going to deal with the lives of both sisters. It's a necessary way of connecting these random two guys to the Vox family instead of adding additional information that you'll need to turn a page and you'll find it. I don't know. As we shall soon see just feels like it's almost like when someone gives you a spoiler. That's what an as we shall soon see sentence or phrase feels like. It's like, spoiler. Okay, just wait a second. So yeah, I've gone way too long about something that's really not terribly important. Most people probably won't even care. I care a lot, as evidenced by the fact that I have gone on and on about it. But that's the minor complaint I have about this book. Yes, for a minor complaint, I've gone on forever. But I actually did thoroughly enjoy this book. I was surprised to find that I actually think I will reread this book. I will roll my eyes every time the author does an as we shall soon see or something like that. But first of all, he doesn't, like in the big bulk of the book, it's like after a while he drops that. I think as he kind of gets into the action himself, he stops doing this kind of foreshadowing because he's in the thick of it, so he doesn't feel like he needs to do as much of the as we shall soon see silliness. But he has a very readable style. He does, other than the as we shall soon see, but he either will quote, he tends to quote within the text his sources, and then at the very end he has a bibliography. He's not one for footnotes, but he'll let you know where the sources come from. So I don't have the quibbles I do have with some works where I'll be like, well, where did you get that from? He's pretty good about giving you an idea of where it comes from, especially since we have multiple sources who left their writings behind in the way of letters and memoirs, that kind of thing. So he had a lot of information to go off of. So we feel like, okay, yes, anything that he attributes to these people, we have a pretty good idea that that's actually fact, and the author does a good job of establishing that. Now, I did have to laugh, and this was the editor's fault for not catching this, was the author referenced a book, which I actually do have, and in bibliography, he has it down right. It's the autobiography of a hunted priest, and it's by John Gerard. In the bibliography, he says it right. The autobiography of the hunted priest. Now, this is what the editor should have caught. In text, at one point, he calls it the autobiography of a haunted priest. And I'll be honest, I looked it up to just make sure I wasn't missing, like there wasn't a similar autobiography from the period of time called the autobiography of the haunted priest, because he also attributed it to the translator and not to the priest author, which is not something he does in the bibliography either. So I don't know if that was like something that he had in a draft that he didn't catch when he, before he sent it off to the editor, and then the editor didn't say, hey, look, you missed this based off of your bibliography. Is this what you actually meant? So I do think that a little bit more in the way of help from the editor could have helped miss something that was honestly a funny but pretty simple mistake. The difference between the autobiography of the haunted priest and the autobiography of the hunted priest. Autobiography of haunted priest doesn't seem to make as much sense in context. But that was just a funny mistake. But this book, the women that are featured in this are very interesting women, quite brave women. Both the priests and the women get a very good showing of, we give a very good showing of their bravery and what they were willing to go through in order to practice their faith and to make it so others could practice their Catholic faith during a period of time where it was made dangerous to do so. Either initially just expensive, but then dangerous, especially if you were Jesuit. They wanted you dead. I think they said that only I want to say there were only like 2 Jesuits that went in, survived to the end. Maybe there was 3. One of the ones that was at the very end, who is the head of the Jesuits. One of them who left fairly early on. And then Father Gerard. And after he left England, he was never able to go back. He left a little bit after the gunpowder plot. And he wasn't able to go back. It wasn't safe for him anymore. And they still tried to get him kicked out of Belgium from England. But another person that comes across very well, and it's a very interesting person, they called him Little John. And he was a priest hole maker. And I ended up picking up, because I found him so interesting. He was canonized a priest in the Catholic Church. St. Nicholas Owen, priest hole maker. And you don't get to see as much of the pictures of his priest hole in this book, but there's a fair amount of them in St. Nicholas Owen, priest hole maker. And from I can tell this is the only biography available on Nicholas Owen, also known, usually called Little John in this book, because I guess it was his nickname because he was a smaller man. But there are, I was just going to see if they give, no, it looks like mostly pictures of they have pictures of the different figures, but not of, it doesn't look like they have any pictures of any of Little John's priest holes. Now, they do have a statue of Little John himself. This is Nicholas Owen, carved by Dennis Mitchell, St. Joseph's Roman Catholic Church in Wednesbury, West Midlands. So, the descriptions of the tortures that some of these priests went through, actually some of the women as well, they didn't necessarily, at the beginning, it didn't seem like they were torturing the women to the same extent, but the first martyr had a pretty terrible death. She was crushed. And successively, as you got farther along, especially when they wanted to get more of the Jesuits and figure out who are the people who are involved in hiding them, the tortures, the descriptions of the tortures came more into play, especially when you're dealing with people who survived to write their memoirs, who were tortured, like Father Gerard was. And his description of it, just that which was shared in this book, was difficult to read. I can only imagine reading the full extent of his story is going to be pretty intense. And I've heard that this book reads kind of like, that his memoirs kind of read like an adventure story. You get a flavor of that from this, because it is, while it's must have been absolutely terrifying to live through, it's really exciting to read about once you get past some of the early stylistic issues that I have with this work. One of my biggest problems, other than my, stylistic gripes, is the fact that I found this book to be very bad for my self-control. I scoured through the bibliography, and I ended up picking up several of the books mentioned in there. I already had the autobiography of a hunted priest, but I ended up picking up the St. Nicholas Owen biography. I checked into several of them. Several of them I either wasn't able to find, like I wanted to find the Vox of Herodin, a recusant family. Either I couldn't find it for a good price, or I couldn't find it at all. And I wanted to find memoirs of missionary priests. I don't think I was able to find that one at all. I did end up grabbing the Gunpowder Plot by Antonia Fraser, this author's Gunpowder Plot book, and then one that was called, where is it? Because they mention it in here. I'm just trying to find. God's Secret Agents by Alice Hogg. So I figure those 3 books will give me several different authors' point of view on the same time period, which is cool, but I found them all to be very tempting. I could have easily picked up most of the books on this bibliography list, to be quite honest with you. It was very hard not to. I really wanted to pick up The Troubles of Our Catholic Forefathers Related by Themselves. It was a 3-part series. I could only find part 3, and I think it was like I couldn't justify the cost. I don't think I was able to find the Catholics of York under Elizabeth, or During the Persecution by Father Gerard is a previous version of this before it got retranslated, I guess. I wanted to find, apparently there was a biography out there somewhere on Father Henry Garnet, who was for 20 years the head of the Jesuits, who somehow managed to keep alive for 20 years, going from house to house to house, along with Little John, house to house to house. And he was just very careful, and he managed to survive. Gunpowder Plot was what really turned the heat on to him, even though he wasn't involved in it. But I really wanted to find his biography, and I wasn't able to, which was very disappointing to me. The Other Face, Catholic Life under Elizabeth I was something that was interesting to me. I couldn't find that either. So several of these books I really wanted to find, and I was disappointed that I couldn't find. But the ones I did find, I did end up being tempted and picked up several of them. Couldn't find The Life of Father John Gerard by John Morris. I guess you could argue that I have the memoir, but I would kind of like to have seen if there were other sources that he was able to pull from besides the memoir that could have given me a view outside of the priest's own personal view of himself, But anyway, so I think that, how would I rate this book? I think I ended up giving it a 4-star. Because even in spite of my issues stylistically with how it was written, and the kind of funny little mistake about the haunted priest versus the hunted priest, honestly, I do think this is a good book. I think that there's a lot of information in here that I know personally I was not fully aware of. I knew that it was bad. I knew that there were priest holes, but I wasn't aware necessarily of the extent of some of the tortures. Hearing the different stories was really interesting. And I do think this one is actually, you can argue that this is actually a pretty good unbiased source, because this doesn't appear to be a Catholic author. Actually, I believe in the very beginning, the author makes a point saying he's not Catholic. So this isn't like I went to Ignatius Press and started off with a Ignatius Press book on Catholic England during this time period, or even Eamon Duffy, who I know is Catholic, because I have a couple of his books where at least one of his books where he talks about being Catholic. I think the book's called Road to Emmaus. But this author does not necessarily have a bias that I would have. Now, I believe, actually, I'm not even sure about Antonian Fraser or God's Secret Agent. I want to say God's Secret Agent might be put out by Ignatius, but I'm not sure. But this one wasn't. This one was Pen and Sword Books. And like I said, the author made a point at the beginning of mentioning that he was not Catholic. And there are some ways that he words things that you can tell that he's not Catholic. So I do feel like you get a pretty good unbiased viewpoint while still getting a feeling of how difficult it was to live during this period, and how being Catholic was made to be equated with being a traitor, and how it eventually got worse and worse. They do touch on, towards the end, how long it took for Catholics to get some of their rights back. I know that, I want to say it was a couple years ago. Well, it would have been at least a couple years ago. I remember hearing that Elizabeth II had only, a bit before she passed, repealed one of the anti-Catholic laws on the books that prevented Catholics from marrying into the royal family. And I don't know if it was into the royal family, at all, or if it was marrying the heir specific. I don't know. I just remember being surprised hearing that there were still on the books that kind of law. Now, I also don't know why, as a devout Catholic, you would feel comfortable marrying into the royal family, because if the head of the Anglican Church is the monarch, then it's not really compatible for you to be a devout Roman Catholic and then then have to recognize your family member or even your spouse as the head of the church. I don't know why you would put yourself in that position. But regardless, I was still kind of surprised to find that was a law on the books. And this also made me think of another book that I have. They're mentioning how long it took to get certain rights back. There's a book that I have that's called, I don't remember what it's called. Basically, it came up when I was reading my dearest friend, the letters of Abigail and John Adams. John Adams writes a letter to Abigail about while he and John Quincy are in England, when he is when he's acting as an ambassador to England, he mentions that there are some anti-Catholic riots going on because there was signed into law allowing Catholics to have more rights than they had previously. And John sounds horrified in this letter about the anti-Catholic bigotry that made it so that way there were these attacks on Catholics and also attacks on even members of Parliament, as I recall, because there was such anger at allowing Catholics to have rights that would bring them a little bit more into having the same rights, even close to the same rights as some of their fellow, non-Catholic citizens. So I do have that book because I remember being surprised. I knew that it took a while. I remember hearing that Queen Victoria talking about some of the rights that were going to be, they're talking about getting more rights for Catholics. I remember reading about that in a book about Queen Victoria as well. But because I hadn't really thought much about Catholic rights in England to that extent during that period of time, during the time of the Revolutionary War, hearing about it from John Adams, who also wasn't really pro-Catholic. He wasn't like violently anti-Catholic, as in like he did make sure that the Carols went with them, or he was agreeable to the Carols going with them to Canada, so that way the Canadian Catholics there could get the sacraments while they were trying to also court the Canadians as allies against the British. But so he wasn't utterly opposed to making it so other people could get their sacraments, for example, even though he felt like he and Abigail needed to keep it on the down low. But for John to be so shocked and horrified in his letters really kind of told me how bad those riots were. It sounded like the way he had expressed it sounded like it was kind of scary to be there at that period of time. And I look forward to reading that book. But yeah, that kind of gets that general idea of how long it took to get past some of the extreme lack of rights that were started here. How long it took to get rid of the vestiges of that is actually kind of surprising. It never really stayed as bad as it was during this period of time. It did get lighter as time went on, but it didn't make it easy at all to be Catholic in England for quite a while. But yeah, very interesting book. I very much enjoyed it. It's an exciting book. I think that someone who, even if someone isn't into reading a lot of history books, if they find history books be a bit dry normally, I think they would still enjoy this book because the topic matter is exciting and it's handled in a way that makes an exciting read. It doesn't feel dry. Although I think it would be hard to make this specific topic dry when you have so many first-person accounts left behind. So, yeah, I think that that's it for this book. I hope that you enjoyed this review. I probably will have to trim a little bit because I know I got a little rambly here and there, but I'll try to fix that. Yeah, that's all I have to say. I will see you again for the next video. You have a blessed day. I will see you next time. God bless. Bye.
Books keep coming home with me. Piles so tall, they're all I see. Turn a page and sail the sea. Reading always feels so free.